Hello, I'm William Brown. I'd like to show you my Tree of Life chests and a few of the interesting features that you might like to see in the process of making them. These boxes are a very simple, traditional form. I had an idea in my mind for a few months of using the Tree of Life motif, which is a shaker, very popular shaker motif, goes back to the mid-19th century, 1800s. Mary Cahoon is attributed as the originator, although I've read that it actually goes back much further than that. But it's just a design I like, and I wanted to incorporate it into some of my furniture that I make. And I found that this was a form that it worked pretty well. It just gives you a big piece of real estate in order to fit the design in. So I'm actually making a series of these. These were sort of prototypes. I have a third one, which is cherry. This is walnut, figured maple, and the third one is figured cherry with a multicolor pattern. They're diametric opposites of each other. I went through this with the shop tour, which you can see in the as one of the videos below. So I'll show quickly some of the features. They have different types of insert trays that slide, that can be used, that can be removed, and felt lined, and try to make it practical so you could use it for jewelry or whatever. What I'd like to talk about is the inlay. I used the William & Mary style bun feet, which are multiple woods, and again, these are diametric opposites, so where there's dark here, there's light here. Got some pretty hinges, and I've got a latch. I'll show you a jig for that, which made it, since I'm making 12 of them now, I can show you how I do that very quickly. And this is a walnut version, just very simple in a tray. My cherry chest has a fretwork tray inside, and I think I'm going to use this for the 12 new chests I'm making. And I could talk about that a little bit as well. So let me get these out of the way and just talk a little bit about some of the aspects of construction. It's just a basic dovetailed box. I cut my dovetails with fine pins. I think it just looks nice, and something you really can't do well with a router jig. So I actually use a combination of hand and power tools. The quickest way I found is to do my pins first. I will clamp a piece of wood on the piece where I'm going to be cutting the pins, lay out my pins. I will hand saw them quickly, and then I use a router. So you've got a base behind, and you've got basically a piece of wood behind that serves as a stabilizing platform, and you can very quickly route out all the waste with very nice flush, even bottoms. I'll then take my pin board and lay it out on the tailboard and mark out my tails. Usually I'll cut these on the bandsaw and then chop out the waste with a chisel. So this is not really a dovetail tutorial, but just very briefly, those are the steps. The inlay is done, all my prototypes was all done by hand. I use carving gouges, and I essentially make the size of the inlay according to the size of my carving tools. So This is all recessed, and then the holly is inlaid to give you that final tree of life. I'll use curved chisels and just essentially hammer out with a mallet the recess. I will take a small router, or you can even use a Dremel tool with a base. I get it from Stuart Mac. It's super handy for inlay. And after chiseling out the outline, I'll clear out the waste with a router bit. And then I will cut thin slices of veneer. I cut my own holly veneer. I've got tons of it, and cut it with the same tools. And it actually sounds extremely difficult and cumbersome, but as you do it, you get into a flow, and it does get pretty fast. But it is a lot of work. Let me talk briefly about, I think I'm just going to go back to this real quickly. This is a fretwork pattern that I used on another piece of actually Chippendale furniture. It's just a nice traditional repeating pattern. After I get that cut out on the scroll saw, I'll sometimes double up and do two at once. I like to round all the edges. A little thing I do is I use duct tape or two-sided carpet tape and just lay out sandpaper, cut that into strips, and you have a very handy way of sanding all your fretwork. So it's just something I find, and this little piece of sandpaper lasts a really long time when it's backed by duct tape. Sometimes I'll take self-stick sandpaper and just double it over. I find that falls apart, but the duct tape or carpet tape holds up really for a long time. Another thing I wanted to talk about very briefly is these side pieces have a simple inlay pattern. Holly on walnut. In this case, I use black inlay on maple. On the cherry, I'll use different colors. And since I'm making so many of these, I normally do it all with hand tools. But I started to do it because it's kind of production woodworking. What I do is I made a template. And I will grab a piece here. You can see pretty well it's got maple background and black inlay. And I will just get my template on there, get it centered. And then I take my little Dremel. I use little tiny router bits. I have a bunch of these. I'll go anywhere from 1/40th diameter up by 64ths up to I'll go 1/32nd, 3/64ths, and 1/16th. I like the 1/32nd a lot. It's really a nice fine line. For this one, I actually used a 1/16th size bit. But get my template on there. You can attach it with double stick tape or just clamp it and do it 2 runs. And just take my router and follow that template, being very careful to hug the pattern. The router bit has a straight part, and that straight part acts as a surface guide so that it doesn't wander. You just have to be careful. For the great majority of the line inlay that I do, I'm making pieces as one-offs, just one piece. I showed you how I would do it with a production run where I'm making 24 or more, and I want to do it really fast. But that involves making templates and some things that I wouldn't normally do. If I'm making just a one-off, I will use a radius cutter, which is a lie-nielsen tool, and one that I really like. It was designed, I think, with Steve Latta. And I'll just, you can get different size cutters. I've actually sharpened them. It's really tricky, but they can be sharpened. And the cutters come in I think they're a 32nd and a 16th. And it's essentially just a scratch tool where you will get a center point and you just scratch your inlay. And it's got cutters that are shaped like saw teeth. So it is very efficient, and you can make grooves very quickly with this. That's how I do really pretty much all of my curved inlay. There's another way to do it, and I've tried this. It actually does work. This is a pair of old vintage dividers, and you can sharpen the one end to a fine point, and then the other end you can make into grind it into a cutter and sharpen it, and then you can again just use that as a cutter. And I think this was used a lot with the original 18th century inlay. So I just wanted to show that. It's just another way to do it, and works well for me as well. After I get the groove cut all the way around, I'm ready to do the inlay. To do that, I cut my own stringing. Again, holly, I start with a board. I get it down to fairly thin pieces. I cut it on the table saw. Got to be real careful with the safety. I keep a piece of wood and a very thin curved blade, a guide that basically it slips under. Maybe I can show that if we have time, or another time. But that process, Chuck Bender did something really great on that. You can look up. After I get the pieces cut, I have to size them to fit the groove. So in order to size the inlay strips, which I have cut on the table saw, this is a piece of holly. I will use a oscillating spindle sander with a large size sanding head on it. I use a little guide fence in the back, clamp it on, and I just run this through a very narrow gap, and then I do a little experimenting. It takes a few tries until I get just the right size. It's actually much easier than it sounds, and I'll just do very fine tuning with this guide fence until I get this inlay just the perfect size to fit in there. No measurements involved. It's all just a little trial and error. Once I get this set, I can run these strips through really fast, and that's a lot of inlay. I mean, I can do probably 2 sides with one little piece, and I've got tons of holly, so it's just it's wonderful, very white, stands out well on dark wood. Now that we have the recess cut in our piece of wood, we're going to do the inlay. I use a little butcher block. I have my stringing, which we have sized appropriately for the groove. And I start by cutting the corners. I like to have these plain blades around. I sharpen them, grind them down to about a 10-degree, very sharp bevel. And that way you get much cleaner corners on your inlay. So I will cut my 45-degree angle with my plane blade. I'll take my piece, I'll lay it into the groove, go down to the other end, and I will make a mark, or just take a razor blade and cut that other end, and I will then just basically put a line of, I just use yellow glue, doesn't matter, into the groove, put the piece in. To do the curved part, if it's very thin inlay, you can really just take it and bend it around. If it's brittle stuff like this, I will get a hot plate and some water and put my piece in the water for a few seconds, take it out with some tweezers. At that point it's usually very pliable, so lay my glue in the groove. It should be go in pretty easily. If I want a really tight curve for something else, not this, but something that's really tight, where you may be wanting to get, I don't know if you can quite see that, but if you're wanting to get a tighter radius, I will use a piece of pipe. Got different sizes of pipe, and I'll just take a pair of pliers, and I think it was Glenn Huey who I saw do this. I thought it was a great idea. Put it in my vise, heat it up with a torch, get my piece of stringing, and again I'll wet it. This is a piece of banding, black, white, black. Works with banding pretty much anything. And after this has gotten pretty hot, I will just take this and round it over the pipe. It will curve very nicely. I usually like a backer, so I might use a feeler gauge, thin piece of metal to back it so it doesn't split. And then you'll get a nice curved piece for a tight curve. Another little thing I wanted to show was, again, for making these in a sort of production run, I just made a little jig that made it much quicker to cut the inlay for the latch for the top. Normally, again, I would just do this with hand tools, a gent saw and chisels, and it would go pretty quick. But I've found making a lot of them, I can do it even quicker by just spending the time, made a jig, and use a router. So I'm going to get the top on here. Okay, and what I use is a little jig. I went through this on my Instagram, you can see if you wish. And I mark the center point of where I want to put the latch. It's just a little ball catch that I use as a latch. Mark the center point. I have a center point on my jig. I put my jig on right here, line up the 2 points. I then just basically clamp that on. Stick another clamp over here. I use a router with a base on it and a up spiral bit, and I can do it with a few passes, and I've got my recess for the ball catch. It's really quick, and again, if you're making stuff in quantity, a little jig like that can be helpful. I end up with a perfectly sized recess for my ball catch. So that's about all. I just wanted to share a few little things about the construction of this chest. It's a very fun project. There's a lot of things to learn, a lot of great techniques. If you feel that you might be interested in having a class on this topic or a video that you could pay for, please let us know in the comments below. Thank you very much.
If you're interested in woodworking with a mix of hand tools and power tools, visit my website at woodandshop.com, where you can find a bunch of free woodworking lessons, workshop tours of amazing woodworkers, and our very popular tool buying guides. Make sure you subscribe to my free newsletter and check out my 10 steps for getting started in woodworking. Enjoy!